All right, folks, welcome to our second lecture on Porter's interplay and the wisdom of the body. So, just to remind you again, Interplay is a performance oriented nonprofit organization that holds workshops that are dedicated to get people interacting with each other, moving in their bodies, and performing with one another as a way of building community, building communicative skill sets, and building knowledge through interaction. So it's something that happens all across the country. They have national and international chapters. Workshops and interplay are held oftentimes in churches or in corporate meetings, and also in, contexts in which people are studying performance studies. So it's something that has a wide range of different types of applications. Over the course of our lecture today, I'm going to ask you to do two different activities from the interplay reading. So I want you to start off then, before we get into the lecture in detail, just on whatever piece of paper you were writing on before, I want you to just describe what you did this morning for yourself. Describe what the act of getting up was like, what the act of preparing to go to school, or I mean to sit at your computer and listen to lectures was like, what your experiences were this morning up until lecture. Be as detailed or as you want, or as comprehensive as you want. The point is just, what do you remember as being the most defining parts of your morning? What did you feel? What did you do? What did you think? What were you talking about? Did you have interactions? Just take a minute and sketch out what your morning was like. Okay, pause, because I'm gonna tell you what I want you to do afterward, but that would kind of give away a little bit of the writing exercise, so just take a minute. Okay. Now, once you have unpaused and got done with this, what I want you to do is look at your list, and I want you to think about what you wrote down that is, like we did with our introductory exercise, that is an emotion, that is a thought, that is a physical feeling, that is a sense. What is it that defined your morning, that was thinking, and what is it that was outside of thinking? Like doing or feeling, that defined your morning. So I want you to just read over and say, okay, what is the emphasis here? Is it on my physicality? Is it on what I was physically feeling? Is it on my emotions, what I was emotionally feeling? Or is it on my thought, what I was thinking in my head? And I want you to seriously consider where the priority was in your free writing of your experience this morning. Because as we transition now to talk about the rest of Porter, what we're going to be talking about is how the body, how feeling, usually gets marginalized or subordinated to thought. How what we usually prioritize is our thought over our feelings. But, Porter is going to argue, most of what we know and experience in the world at least also depends on how we feel and what occurs in our body, in addition to what we think. So, I want you to see how that bears out in your own writing. Are you spending more time talking about how you felt? Or is there a part of your experience that would be left out if we only talked about what we thought? Or are you really focused on thinking in your own writing? Some of us may be different. Many of us prioritize different parts of our own experience. So I want you to look over your writing then and reflect, what parts of experience do you prioritize? And as we now move to talk about Porter, we're going to be talking about different ways in which we might think about the body, feeling, and emotion as a way of generating knowledge or understanding the world around us. But our focus here isn't going to be as much on interplay as it's going to be about the arguments concerning rather the relationship between what we know, our knowledge and our experience, and the body. That's going to be the main nature of the discussion we're going to have. But we are going to talk a little bit about the way that this is applied through interplay in the workshops that they put on, and the way that they try to cultivate this sort of experience in a couple of different examples. So to start off then, they make the argument, Porter and his writing partner make the argument that different bodies are different. And that interplay is interested in exploring all the things that a body can do. And I don't know if this is intentional or not, but he's riffing off, this appears to be, to me, a riff on a claim that a early modern philosopher named Baruch Spinoza makes, that's later taken up by a postmodern philosopher named Guy Deleuze, that is, nobody knows what a body can do. Nobody knows what a body can do. And the basic nature of this argument, that we don't know all the things that a body might be capable of, that we ought to be exploring what our bodies can do, what bodies experience, what they might be capable of, it comes from the idea that for the majority of our lives and for the majority of history, the main way in which we have constructed human experience, like we've been talking about this entire time, is through language. That we think about thought as being the most basic human thing. That we think about thought as being the defining thing that makes humans humans. You can think about Descartes saying, I think, therefore I am. The idea of the human being as a fundamentally or essentially rational animal, or as a symbol-using creature. These are all ways in which we have defined humanity before. But Porter wants to say that this only accounts for a very small range of the human experience, is that we really need to be thinking about the way in which our bodies are a site of experience in which things like thought intersect with spiritual, physical, emotional, and other forms of knowledge to produce what our worlds are and to produce meaning. That is where knowledge and meaning comes from. It's not just from language, it's not just from thought, it's from the experiences that we have in our bodies. And that interplay then is about, as a practice, expanding the number of experiences our bodies can have in order to increase the types of knowledge we have and the types of experiences in the world we have. So, interplay then, Porter wants to say, is about these concepts of spirit, play, and collaboration. And by spirit, he means the emotional or the aesthetic, in addition to what you might think about as actually being spiritual or divine if you are of a religious persuasion. Porter is not demanding that you are religious in any sense here. He's saying that there is a part of all human experience that is spiritual, meaning that it is connected to the way in which we experience the natural world, the way in which we experience things like wonder and awe and fear and experiences of the sublime, that all of these things are spiritual experiences because they are deeply felt. Play is another category that he says is not often taken into account by language, which is that language, as we've said, is all about meaning, and play is not about typically establishing meaning. It is about rearranging meaning. It's about spontaneity and opening up boundaries. So play doesn't happen in a world where things only communicate specific and clear things. Play happens in a world of ambiguity, of contingency. That means uncertainty, of spontaneous interactions between you and others. And that's the nature of collaboration as well for Porter, is that you work together, you work in tandem, and you learn from each other. And collaborative interaction is not just about thinking, it's about interacting with others. It's about an exchange that happens between bodies that in many ways is productive or profitable for whatever the problem or subject we're investigating is. For example, you might think back to times in which you have collaborated in groups before, and ways in which that collaboration has been either profitable or negative in the past. When we collaborate with groups well, oftentimes this is about sharing energy as much as it is about sharing ideas. It's about the back and forth conversation or the rapport you have with your peers, so that not only you're bringing different knowledge together, you're bringing different experiences together, you're bringing different skill sets and energy levels together, and through those interactions then you might produce something different. You might learn things that aren't directly related to simply what you know, but are more related, or that your knowledge is being built through things that aren't just an exchange of words, but also an exchange exchange of energy, but also an exchange of resources, of all of these things that are not just located in language, all of these things that are not just located in language. So when we think about then the nature of interplay, Porter uses this phrase body intellectuals to describe what he is trying to get at here. He's trying to challenge the separation of experience into distinct categories and root experience, learning, and knowledge in the body, root our experience of the world in the body. So he starts us off then by saying that we need to think about the intersection between the body and the intellect, to think about the intersection between the body and the intellect. So we might think, for instance, about how fear or prejudice might inflect our understanding of knowledge. That is, are there things that we agree with simply because we are afraid of the alternatives, or dismiss because we are afraid of the alternatives? Are there things that affect our behavior beyond knowledge? So, for instance, you might think about the context in which we currently are living in the COVID-19 pandemic. So, we have this idea that the virus we have not found a vaccine for it so far. It is still spreading rapidly. So our knowledge tells us likely we should stay inside. We should continue to wear masks. We should continue to not see people. But if you watch people every day, you can see that they go outside without masks, that they are not really taking protective measures to prevent themselves or others from getting the virus, that they are spending time with large groups of people. And in these circumstances, we might think about how the desire for sociality or a prejudice that has been cultivated against the authority of science, or a sense of or emotional investment in freedom over anything else might inflect rather, I didn't mean to say infect, inflect the relationship or influence the relationship between what we believe that we know that the virus is bad and our behavior, how we act in response to it. So there are ways in which our feelings, our fears or our prejudices or our investments or our excitements or our emotions, these things change our understandings of knowledge. It is a commonly known scientific fact that people are far more likely to believe information that confirms their own existing viewpoints as they are information that contradicts that, but is empirically or backed up by reality. Because people don't like being emotionally uncertain, because people like the feeling of being correct. So oftentimes we seek out, it's called the confirmation bias, information that affirms that we were already right about something. So these are examples then about how our bodies inform our intellect. This also happens in really, really mundane ways too. So maybe you're starving right now, so you can't focus on anything that I'm saying. Your body is mediating your ability to learn. Your body is mediating your ability to learn. So that is one of the main things about body intellectuals. It wants to think about the intersection between the way that we feel and how those feelings, whether they're spiritual, emotional, or physical, might mediate or inflect what we understand the world to be, or what we understand to be reality. The second thing that body intellectuals do then, and Porter says, is they want to trace or imagine the experiential roots of sociopolitical reality. So we'll have to break that down a tiny bit, but the idea here is that interplay encourages us to think about knowledge, about what we know, as something that is not just given or true, but something that is experienced and learned through our embodied act of existing. So it wants us to use performance as a tool to think about what the experience of politics or of society might be like, to better understand those things. So we might try then to inhabit the role of a service industry worker to understand how they might be going through in these sorts of moments. We want to inhabit the idea of somebody who is impoverished to understand what it might be like. Of course, there's always a risk here because we can't know a lot of times what people outside of our cultural positions actually experience. But trying to put ourselves in those kinds of positions is a condition for understanding these things in a better and more full-fleshed way than we would if we just read about them secondhand and never tried to put ourselves in the experiential position of those political situations. So a lot of performance then is about enacting or reenacting social or political circumstances to reveal what that experience is like, and also to think about ways in which we might be able to change those experiences. And we'll talk about that more later on in the semester when we get to discussing participatory performance in particular. And then the third thing that's important about body intellectuals for Porter is that it uses the body as a tool for exploring ideas. That is, we don't just want to learn things with our brain through language, that we want to think about what or we want to think through ideas by enacting them, by exploring them. So, for instance, if you wanted to understand what it was like to be somebody who is working in the service industry, or in the gig economy, or who is living through poverty or has been discriminated against on the basis of their gender, gender identity, sex, sexual orientation, or race, any of these things, you will never be able to simply understand those things through reading about them or having them described to you. Although, of course, there will always be limits to your ability to understand these things if you don't belong to those groups. The way in which we understand these things more is not by having their knowledge communicated to us, but having the experience communicated and trying to embody the experience to the extent that we can. And of course, we always have to mark the limits of what we know, what we can empathize with, what our own subject positions are in relationship to what we're performing. But the idea is that you probably cannot know the experience of, for instance, living in poverty unless you have similarly had the experience of extreme stress all the time about how you're going to make ends meet or experiencing actual hunger sometimes or things like that. That those things are deep parts of knowing what it is like to be in poverty that are experiential. And because they're experiential, we can't just know them through language. There has to be a way in which we can try to access the physical, the emotional capacities of those experiences. And again, of course, we can never access fully or put ourselves fully in another person's shoes. And impersonating another culture and then pretending you understand what they have gone through is terrible. But in the same way that you can never understand what poverty really feels like unless you've understood its conditions, you can never really understand what it is like to be oppressed because of your race or oppressed because of your gender or sexual orientation or gender identity unless you have had some of the body emotional experiences of those things, or at least have witnessed or have those things related to you in a way that makes them easier to grasp. So the idea isn't that you should go out and perform people whose identities you don't share, although some empathetic types of trying to perform from the standpoint of another can be really fruitful and politically provocative sometimes. But we always want to make sure we're marking the limits of our own knowledge. But that being said, performance then can become a vehicle in which you are not only told how something feels or what something means, but it is demonstrated to you. A person performs the experience. They inhabit something in your body, and therefore what you experience about that thing resonates perhaps more with you than it would otherwise if you were simply told. Also, in some circumstances, we will use performance to try to imagine or try to put ourselves in the shoes of others in order to have have a more robust or emotional or intellectual connection with their experiences. As long as we're marking the limits of our own knowledge and doing these things effectively and not claiming to speak for these people that can, or the people who we're performing the cultures of or performing the experiences of, as long as we're not claiming that we know and that we're speaking for them, those sorts of experiences can be valuable exercises in empathy. And that's something that Porter wants to emphasize here. Again, we should never go out and pretend that we understand the experience of somebody we do not. But what Porter is saying is that we can't even get close unless we start to understand through performance, through the body, what these things feel like and how and the emotions that attach to these sorts of experiences. So understanding politics, understanding social relationships, all of these things depend on the body as much as they depend on language or thought, Porter is going to argue. So this brings us naturally to the next section, which is physicality, And so we've been talking about how interplay is about emphasizing the body and about being a body intellectual and trying to learn through your body. But in those circumstances, that doesn't mean that we should draw an arbitrary line between our body, for instance, and our thoughts. What Porter really wants to emphasize is that what we tend to do when we think about the world is we divide things into the different categories. We have this idea that we are both a mind and a body, and that our mind does our thinking and our body does our feeling, or that we're a mind, a body, and a spirit, and that our spirit is involved in things like faith or feeling, our body is involved in feeling and sensory perception, and our mind is involved with thinking. But the argument that Porter wants to make is no. In fact, all of these things are in our body. How could we experience these things if they were not in our body? That emotion, or whatever we experience as spirituality in our thoughts, all of those things occur in our body just as much as sensory perception, sight, smell, hearing, or physical sensations like hunger occur in our body. That thoughts and spirit are just as much of our body, he argues, as things like our physical sensations, and also what he calls heart, our emotions. So all of these things, then, he says, are divided into categories, and usually we put our mind and our thought on top, and we say that our mind ought to be in control of our body. That you probably heard the expression before, mind over matter, that as long as you exert your will or your thoughts, you can control your body fully. But that's not true, first of all, or at least for most people. And second of all, that brackets the fact that all of what we experience is in our bodies, that we can't experiencing things outside of our bodies. Moreover, Porter wants to argue that the different things that we feel actually only make sense if we associate them with one another. If I say something like, that's immoral, that sentence doesn't have nearly as much meaning if we just think about it as something that communicates. It actually is connected to my feelings, my senses of right and wrong, which is something that oftentimes you have a gut experience or an emotional experience of. Morality, our senses of justice, are things that are oftentimes in our body just as much, if not more, than they are in the language that we use to discuss them or in what we express. So when I say, that's immoral, I'm not just saying something is true, I'm saying that I feel a certain way, and this has a direct implication for how you should act or how you should feel. So I'm communicating something that is more than truth, that is more than language. I'm communicating something that is oftentimes a body experience. So when he talks about, then, the ways in which we need to prioritize physicality, he's not just saying we need to think about our physical experiences, he's saying we need to think about the way in which the body brings all of these different kinds of experiences together. So to understand things holistically is to understand how our experiences relate to each other, how they interrelate, that is, how they influence each other. He says you don't need to be able to describe experience in order to name it. You don't have to be able, or in order to have it. You don't have to be able to say, I felt X, Y, and Z in this explicit sort of order for you to say, I had experience of hunger, or I had an experience of loss. You might not know how to describe describe that in words, but you still feel it. So interplay then is about thinking about this relationship between what we think and what we know, and the way that we experience things through our bodies, like emotion, like sense perception, like spiritual or aesthetic feelings, like connections with nature, like connections with other people. All of these things influence the way that we learn, the way that we interact within our environments, and what we see. So, the next section, then, he's going to make this argument a little bit more strongly that when we try to categorize our experience into these different sets, into mind, heart, body, spirit, that all of these things are made up of physical information, and that a lot of times this prevents us from experiencing these things as holistic, So, for instance, we think about listening to music as an auditory experience, but if you have been at a music performance when it is 100 degrees and everybody is sweating on you, part of that musical experience comes from things that are outside of your simple hearing of what is going on, or your watching of the band. It comes from your collaboration or interaction with the bodies around you, and you might feel either great or really uncomfortable because of those other things that actually don't have much to do with what is literally being played. When people give lectures or talk to you, they create emotional and physical impressions on you that really influence how you digest that material, that really influences what you think about both the person talking about the thing and what they're talking about. So we can't just separate our experiences into these easily disassociable, or we can't pull apart the way in which we experience the world. We experience the world with our bodies, our minds, our spirituality, or our emotions all at the same time. And that trying to pull these things apart, he argues, hollows out our experience, He says that categorical separations bar us from experiencing wholeness, is from experiencing everything that goes into a musical performance, a theatrical performance, a social interaction, instead of just what it is supposed to mean or how we are supposed to interpret it. It's about experiencing things in fullness. And to illustrate this point, or to give an example, in the next section he talks about focusing and having. Focusing and having. And he argues that to notice and experience, we have to pick out physical information of a whole range of things we are experiencing at the same time. So in order to listen to this lecture, for instance, you are bracketing out the sound of the air conditioning whirring in your house. You are focusing on me and not your dogs, and not on your text messages, and not on, maybe you are also focusing on all of those things. But if you are focusing on those things, you probably aren't focusing on this. So we usually select the information we want to focus on, and different people will be trained to judge or listen to their experiences in particular ways. And Porter argues that judgment distances us from our experiences of things, that judgment distances us from our experiences of things. And let's think of a couple of different examples of how that might be true, So we're taught from a pretty young age in school that we should be thinking about ways in which we can constructively add to the work our peers do, constructively respond to what they do, or the way that we can constructively judge our own creations. And we're taught, whether it's in science or performance or in music or anything like that, a system that or different types of knowledges that we use to create these judgments. So we understand, for instance, that there are things like musical technique, or somebody has a good singing voice, and we use those things to judge our experiences of musical performance. We understand that there are certain things we expect from actors, that they appear natural on stage, that they are not overblowing or over dramatizing what they are performing, that they appear to display real real human emotion. All of these things are things that we are taught to judge certain performances on the basis of. But if you and I were to sit down and we were to listen to an orchestra perform together, I might be able to tell you exactly when the violinist plays off key, or exactly when a certain section gets off tempo, and my judgment will inform my experience. But if you have no experience with classical music or whatever type of music is being performed and can't notice those things, you are more likely to take in the fullness of what you are experiencing. So when we judge things, we're distanced from things. When we are judging the performances of the musician, we are not listening to the way in which the audience is reacting or interacting around us, the way in which certain people are being emotionally affected. We are not paying attention to the expressions on the musician's faces. We are not letting ourselves be fully in that moment. So we are distanced from the experience or alienated from the experience we have because we're just trying to fit it into categories. So the idea is then that the categories of knowledge or understanding we have, the majority of which come from the language we use to understand the world, control our experiences or exert control over our experiences. They tell us how to perceive the world and how to interpret it. And if we allow ourselves to more immediately experience the world and experience the world with all of our faculties at the same time, without this intellectual judgment mediating us and what we're experiencing, he argues that we will have a more full experience of whatever it is that we're participating in, from a concert to a conversation, that we are more likely to have this holistic experience. Which isn't to say that none of the tools that we have for evaluating music or performance are worthwhile, but it is to say that if we respond first with judgment, we won't respond in other ways that will allow us to have emotional reactions or intimate connections or experiential reactions with what we're watching or what we're seeing performed in that moment. And so finally, this takes us to the last section, which is to say that this judgment, this sense that when we're evaluating performances or when we're in social reality, we are always judging or attempting to interpret or understand others, is oftentimes also built into a negative reinforcement mechanism. That is, when you're learning, you're often told you're wrong, you're doing something wrong, you need to learn your times tables better, you did not successfully memorize those answers. And with music and with other and theatrical performance and performing poetry, we critique people in similar ways. We say, your tone is wrong, or we say, watch your feet, or face the audience more directly, or you mispronounce that word, or you don't seem to understand the piece that you're performing. All of these things are judgments, are negative reinforcements that are meant to guide us to do something differently or to learn better. But Interplay wants to focus on affirmation instead. It wants to say not that you did something wrong, but ask what you learned from the way in which you did it. Ask what was valuable from that experience, and then to critique in a way that maximizes the value that you might get out of your next experience, as opposed to trying to make you fit some kind of external standard. Now, obviously, there is still a importance to a critique, especially substantive critique, that makes suggestions to help other people learn better. But the focus of Interplay is saying yes and. Saying yes, that was a good reflection, and you might consider doing this in addition to it, and you might consider this as an even better reflection of that same thing. But trying to always say yes to what the performer is exploring, what they're trying to express, and their modes of engaging it, especially through the body. So, from then this discussion of Porter and the idea of interplay, and from our discussion of Austen and how to do things with words, there are two, I think, really important takeaways. One is that performance and performance studies are both intervening into what they perceive to be a world that is ruled by language, and especially language as something descriptive and cold that is scientifically true or false, and is always supposed to be evaluated in terms of in terms of truth and falsity. We want to replace that with the idea in performance and performance studies that there isn't a capital T truth, that the idea isn't to represent something more or less accurately. The idea is to embrace an experimental and experiential way of relating to the world in which we try to learn through our bodies, in which we try to create knowledge through what we do in the world and through the way in which we perform that knowledge and interact with others with what we know and what we believe, the way that we absorb the experiences or try to identify with the experiences of other people, relate to them, and then experiencing them for ourselves through the performances of others and through our own performances to the extent that we can. That performing is, in other words, a way of knowing and a way of doing. For Porter, it's a way of knowing. For Porter, he's saying that our experiences of the world, the things that are valuable in the world, are felt through our bodies, our emotions, our hearts, and our stomachs, that we feel those things all over the place, and that we need to understand that holistic experience. For Austin, it's about saying words don't just communicate, words do, words act, words accomplish. And in both of those ways, then, we want to think about performance as trying to both use language to move beyond simply representing reality, and instead use language to change reality, to use language to act on or in reality, to do more than communicate, but instead to illustrate, to embody, to enact, to make something happen. That's Austin. In terms of Porter, we want to think about performance as a way of knowing, as a way of acting that allows us to experience the totality of, or get closer to experiencing the totality of what it is like to do something, or learn something, or be something, what it is like to work in a certain context, what it is like to have a certain experience, to have gone through a certain trauma, to have a certain life event, that these things, these social and political experiences we have all the time, are not just things we can know, they're things that we have to feel as well. And that performance is about trying to replicate or communicate that experienced or lived dimension of knowledge, that either by performing or by being impacted by the performances of others, we are more likely to get this full and holistic experience of whatever is being talked about or represented through the performance than we would simply in a narration or a simple communication of what the facts of the performance is. That the performance helps us feel. It happens in the body, and therefore it has a more deep and nuanced way of knowing, of relating to the world, than just saying that we can describe it in language. So to engage with this one more time then, I just want you to conclude by doing this activity, and it runs the same sort of, or it covers the same sort of area that we've been talking about through our other activities or our writing exercises so far. So you can find this activity on page 78 of the Porter reading, but I want you to try to sit for a second and write down your responses to at least one of these 5 questions or 5 prompts. So you should sit and either imagine your dream home, the perfect house in which you would like to live, or remember a time in which you did something that you were ashamed of, or add the numbers 15 and 19 without writing them down, or picture someone you find sexually attractive, or to yourself name a brand of automobile. at least do 2 or 3 of these so you can compare them against one another, because all of these are of a different nature of thought or feeling. So when you describe these experiences in your free writing, I again want you to think, what is the main location of this experience? How am I primarily experiencing it? If I'm experiencing my dream home, maybe I have an emotion in mind, like peace or safety, or maybe I'm thinking about an aesthetic experience, like looking at some bay windows or reading in a sunroom. If I'm thinking about a time that I did something I'm ashamed of, maybe I feel shame or guilt or a wish that I could have done better. Instead of something that is a coherent thought, maybe you feel sick to your stomach and nauseous, so it's not so much emotion as it is physical, or maybe that is a combination of the two. If you're doing math, maybe this is cold and analytic, or maybe this is something that for you is very anxiety producing because it gives you flashbacks to when you were in 3rd grade and failing math quizzes. Whatever your experiences are, when you are answering these questions, let them come to the surface and compare them. And I want you to think critically about how it is that you typically understand what you know about the world. Do you think about the world typically as something that is you can know in terms of things are true or false in the world? And I know them through what I learn. I know them through mental knowledge, through what language teaches me, through concepts. Or do you think you experience the world primarily through your emotions? Or do you experience the world primarily through your body? And what you'll probably find through these writing exercises is, depending on what you're doing, you might have a very different experience. But that is something you really, really want to think about and emphasize as we move forward. If you are performing, for instance, this moment in which you used to be ashamed, probably you want to communicate that sick feeling, that physical feeling, that emotional reaction. You just don't want to just say, I am ashamed. So performance is about capturing what the real forward part of our experiences of the world are. Do we experience them with our emotions forward, with our bodies forward, with our thoughts forward? And when we perform these things, that's what we need to try to capture, because that is where the reality of the experience lies. And again, it might lie different places for different people, but you should try to reflect that too. So if you're playing somebody really rational, maybe they don't know how to engage with emotions, but that is itself something that you can enact the experience of. So in this way, then, we want to think about the body in performance as something that is both something that we learn through, that we use as a tool of learning by trying to create experiences for ourselves to have, by trying to act in certain ways, and we want to think about the body as something that allows us to perform or communicate experiences that we have had in the ways that we've had them, above and beyond just the descriptions that we are capable of voicing through our language. And we want to think about how that capability of using the body, of expressing emotions bodily, of interacting with others, is one of the things that separates performance and performance studies from other disciplines that operate exclusively in language or exclusively in descriptions of fact. That performance isn't as interested in fact as it is in capturing the totality of an individual experience, or capturing an experience in detail, in resonance, and knowing what that thing is actually like and what it does in the world. So that's where we're going to wrap up today. So I hope you enjoyed lecture, and I will chat with you tomorrow when we'll talk about our spoken word performances for the first time, and we'll also begin to talk about the relationship between performance and race. Until then, I hope you have a great Monday.